Some things happen without explanation. Some experiences haunt people for a lifetime. This is where I tell those mysteries. And remember, not everything can be explained. Story. My brother captured a mermaid. And now I have a serious problem. I want to preface this by saying, I have never been a superstitious person. I grew up next to the ocean. Where is particularly unimportant. But anyone who grew up in a seaside town can attest to the amount of insane things your brother's girlfriend's dad once saw while out on his boat. I had a best friend in high school who used to swear on his life that once when he was 9, he and his entire family had seen some shapeless blob slowly rise until the shadow of it beneath the water far outsized their small fishing vessel. I used to laugh in his face at that story, along with the hundreds of others I've heard over the years of encounters with various scary ocean monster-based anomalies. After today, I don't feel like laughing anymore. It started when my brother called me this morning. I remember thinking how glad I was that it was the same day my unemployment hit. And my first thought when my phone roused me was, yes, money, followed immediately by fuck. Dempsey is calling me, which means only one thing. Hey Rip, you ready to do the damn thing? No, never, ever was a ready to do the damn thing. The damn thing being fishing, which I absolutely despise. Dempsey, as my older brother of barely 2 years, definitely has always known this about me. Unfortunately, he is one of those people who is endlessly positive. Lose your job due to mass layoffs? Don't worry, Rip. You wanted to look for something better anyway. I can help. Marriage crumbles into shambles? Mom, you and Dad are great people. You will both only be better separate. I know you would never make any choice you didn't think was best. Your favorite character dies on a TV show? Don't worry, we can always watch it over once we finish and enjoy them all over again. You get the idea. Dempsey is one of those people who makes you feel bad just by being himself. As a categorically miserable person, it has always made me want to vomit. I love my brother, but the exact things everyone loves about Dempsey I find annoying. Women love his sandy blonde, somehow perfectly disheveled hair, forest green eyes, and boyish grin. Women and men alike love his athletic talent and charismatic personality. Then the guy has a nerve to become a semi-professional surfer. A surfer. He's a giant parody of himself and doesn't even realize it. Ripley? I jerk involuntarily at the sound of his voice in my ear. I had apparently fallen asleep contemplating the ways I could get out of fishing with him. I'm here. Are we taking Dad's boat? I didn't want to go on any boat. But at least Dad's boat is big and relatively comfortable. Don't bother to comment and ask me what kind. As someone with no interest in boating outside what my family has roped me into over the years, I couldn't tell you. It's big. It's comfortable. My dad likes to deep sea fish, so he bought the boat. I can say it's fairly expensive, as it not only cost what he paid for the boat, but also the alimony he pays my mom now after she filed for divorce for catching him on it with a lady of the evening. Yes, in case you're curious, Dempsey really did tell my mom my dad was a great person. The same day she found out he had been sleeping around on her. I've always said when God called to line up for brains, Dempsey got into the looks line again by mistake. Ripley, are you coming out on Dad's boat with me to fish for some marlin or not? Don't put me off again. You promised me last week that you would definitely come this time. I had fallen asleep again. Fine, pick me up in 20 minutes. So he did. The ride there was uneventful. I sat arms crossed staring out the window, clearly sulking after being morally guilted into coming along on this super fun sibling day. Not my words. Dempsey literally labeled the day as such as soon as I got into his diesel Duramax truck. My sour mood had not deterred my brother, who happily sang country along with the radio, and drove so fast that I was convinced if Dad saw us he would call the police and report the boat we were towing stolen. Dempsey's bronze, slightly sun-freckled hand suddenly turned down David Allen Coe's. You never even called me by my name. I have been thinking about David. It felt like a dagger into my heart. Twisting tight in the silence, he let hang for a few moments. I knew he was being a good brother. A good brother mentions how your dead fiancé has been on his mind, especially coming up on the 3-year anniversary of his death, to let you know that person you loved so much, more than you ever thought you could love a person, wasn't forgotten to him. Dempsey was only being a good brother, and I hated him for it. I think about David every single day. I spat back at him, regretting it almost immediately. He was only trying to be nice, typical of his usual mode. But it was too late. I had backed myself into a dark little corner and I refused to come back out. Every single day. Yes, Ripley. Double down. I remember thinking sarcastically to myself. Dempsey acted like he hadn't even heard the venom in my tone and continued. That was his superpower, ignoring my venom. David loved to come deep-sea fishing with me. The knife twisted again, almost making it hard to breathe. My brother did miss David, with his dark hair and smiling blue eyes reflecting the ocean when he would laugh at Dempsey's stupid jokes. I could hear it in his voice and see it in the tight way he gripped the wheel of the truck. I didn't know what to say to that, because they had loved it, both of them, to a degree that almost made me jealous. I twisted the simple diamond ring on my finger. I hadn't been able to bring myself to get rid of it, or even remove it. We rode the rest of the way to the pier in silence, Dempsey never even bothering to turn the radio back up. Dempsey had to get a man at the pier help him back the boat in and get it unhitched, or whatever. It was something he and Dad normally did while me and Mom watched. So after 2 attempts by me to help him back it in straight, he laughed good-naturedly and asked the man unloading his own boat if he would help. I could see both of them having a good laugh at me as they worked together, while I fumed. Shortly after Dempsey helped me into the boat, we were off, and I held my sunglasses onto my face and another hand tied to a support bar as he opened the boat up. I wanted to ask him what his hurry was, but the wind was loud, and after a while I judged by the look on his face that he was simply enjoying the feeling of the boat slicing through the water as it took us further and further from the pier where we started. After what felt like forever, he pulled back on the throttle and brought our vessel to a crawl. I glanced around, and there was nothing. Open water as far as I could see in every direction. I had been distracted by not trying to feel nauseated for a portion of our journey and had my eyes closed to try and combat it. I was shocked he had brought us so far out. Usually we went far, but the pier would still be visible, albeit very small, in the distance. "You trying to catch a sea monster?" I said cynically to the back of Dempsey's head, and felt awkward when he didn't respond right away with something typical of him. "You would be no help if I was catching a sea monster." You probably wouldn't even touch it. Something lame along those lines. When he turned to face me, his face was eerily calm and yet hyper-aware at the same time. I had never seen him look that way. Demps? What is it? David and I used to come here. The dagger was back, the tip of it pressed against the wall of my heart. Primed and ready. The peculiar expression on his face kept me grounded in the strangeness of the moment. Okay, my voice was smaller than I wanted it to be. But I had never seen my brother act so mysterious. He always said what was on his mind. Every real job he ever had described him in references as honest to a fault. It was just for fun. At first, his voice sounded more normal than his face looked, and somehow that made me even more uneasy. David told me about a book his grandfather had let him read. It was just old book full of sailors' tales. David's grandfather had been a sailor and professional fisherman for many years. So, this far into Dempsey's weird account, I was following him. The book made sense. He told me one of the stories in there was instructions on how to catch a mermaid. So much for all this shit making sense. I opened my mouth to interrupt him. Complain about being dragged out this close to dark. I sleep late. Okay. To hear about some fucking story that David had told him about. He raised a hand to silence me, which normally would have done fuck all, but something about the callous way he did it had the exact reaction he wanted, and I closed my mouth. Officially creeped all the way out. I have been thinking about it a lot since David died, and I think I have figured out the reason it never worked for us. Worked for you? You mean you guys were out here trying to catch? It was the bait. It never had any power. I was creeped into silence again at this point. What did the story say, Dempsey? My small voice was gone, and instead I remember sounding cold and empty when I asked him this. Maybe out of aggravation over a lack of answers. Maybe out of disbelief. They love trinkets. Okay, so apparently, I was going to get a synopsis of the story. Fine by me, all kinds. But it's not like what you see in Little Mermaid. You know, my face must have been confirmation that I indeed did not know. Because we were talking about fucking mermaids. They love trinkets that have been imbued. Pain and suffering imbues energy onto the object, so we figured pawn store jewelry might work. People are really upset pawning grandma's heirlooms to pay their rent, right? I mean, you would figure that would leave some sort of bad juju on it. I still wasn't following him. So you and David used to come out here every single month to fish for mermaids? That's what you expect me to believe. But watching you carry that ring around after David died, the way you cherish it so much, like it's him. I see you touch it when you feel upset, almost like it makes him closer to you. That's what made me realize that loving energy is probably so much stronger. I felt like I was slowly being dipped into ice-cold water. Starting at my feet, the slow realization of what was going on dawned on me. Dempsey no fucking wah. Then it was dark. When I opened my eyes again, my entire body felt tight, like I had run a very long distance in a very short time. There was a throbbing pain right around the area of my left hip. Why you fucking tased me. I could barely talk. My mouth felt like it didn't want to work correctly, and I could tell my words were slurred. That was mostly because my face was still pressed against the boat deck. It tasted like salt. Dempsey had his back to me, standing at the edge of the boat. I could tell he was holding a very large fishing pole, mostly because of the angle of his body. I had to rip. You had to? Slowly I was able to force myself up off the deck to a sitting position. It was still daylight, though not by much, so I couldn't have been out for long. I had a feeling a good majority of the pain I was in was from dropping to the deck the way I had. My head felt like I had been hit with a hammer, and when I reached up I could only feel my thick auburn hair sticking out like a mad woman's after the boat ride and faceplant. No blood, thank goodness. Yes, I had to. You never would have given me the ring. You're damn right I would never have given you the ring. I was managing to get to my feet, pulling on one of the mounted boat chairs to assist me. To do what? Tie it to a line and cast it out hoping to catch a goddamn mermaid? What the fuck is wrong with you, Dempsey? You don't understand. Insanity? You're right, I don't understand insanity because this is insane. You can't hear it. Ripley. For the first time since I had regained consciousness, he glanced back over his shoulder at me. And I was horrified to find he looked stricken. His handsome face drawn with sorrow and longing. His boyish hair limp on his forehead. Lifeless. Just like his eyes. I took a step back, frightened of this hollow thing that almost looked like my brother. The small voice was back. Hear what? He didn't answer, his face whipping back around as the line suddenly started to hiss away. The reel spinning rapidly. I knew it would work. If I hadn't stumbled over closer to the edge of the boat, I wouldn't even have heard this. It seemed like something he was saying to himself. Dempsey grabbed the spinning reel and stopped it dead, causing the line to zing as it became tight and popped up out of the water. Immediately I could tell whatever was on the other end of the line was strong. As Dempsey almost stumbled and the muscles in his arms bulged under the effort. His face was a solid rock of concentration. It seemed like a scene that should be happening against a raging storm, with rain dropping in buckets as he tried to wrangle whatever he had captured into the boat for reasons I can't begin to tell you. But the water was soft and smooth. Ocean birds called in the distance, and the slowly descending sun caused water crests to burn like tiny crescent suns of their own. It was beautiful, and Dempsey's sounds of exertion echoed across the water. It took a very short amount of time before I realized not only could he not do it without my help, but that whatever he was trying to reel in was going to pull him off the side of the boat, and Dempsey was going to let it. Demps. Let go. Tiny voice. Fuck you. I sounded to myself how I did at 5 when Dempsey grabbed the collar of a big dog trying to get our cat, and it dragged him all around the yard for 2 minutes before Mom noticed. I had wanted to yell then, too. Dempsey. Let go. Help me. He roared back, the force of his conviction causing me to run over and grab him around the waist despite my better judgment. Better judgment would have been to demand he release the rod before I helped him. But hindsight is 20/20. He felt like trying to help a tree his waist was so solid in my clenched arms. I wasn't sure if I was even helping. In tandem, we both stepped back a few times, losing a few inches of ground every so often to whatever furious thing he had managed to snag. Then, in a loud splash, it was over. When I look back now writing this, I'm almost 100% positive that she launched herself into the boat intentionally, because there is no way the two of us could have ever reeled her up. With no warning, the tension on the line was gone as she burst from the water and over the safety rails on the boat. She landed next to us with a disgusting wet plop as we fell over. Dempsey's full 180 pounds fell bodily on top of me, and for 2 seconds I couldn't breathe. The 2 seconds of breathlessness dragged into what seemed to be an eternity as I turned my face to see the creature laying on the deck with us. My brother had been right. It wasn't like the Little Mermaid. Her body was a listless gray-green, rubbery. She had no scales, and at first glance I almost thought she was a horribly disfigured dolphin. Until I saw that she clearly had arms, hands, a head and a face, if you could call it a face. Her eyes were small and black, again reminding me of a dolphin. Her forehead bulbous and vastly oversized, with no hair to distract from how oddly shaped her head was. No lips could be seen, so nothing concealed her mouth full of double-rowed serrated teeth. I only knew she was female because her chest had a strangely feminine shape. I know she wasn't dead because she pushed herself up onto her arms, the most human-looking thing she possessed, and looked directly at me. A look that can only be described as primal hatred. I was frozen, my entire body comprised of a solid block of ice. Dempsey had barely been able to dislodge his body off the top of mine in the time it took me to take in the mermaid and feel the full force of her gaze. This is what the single antelope feels, knowing lionesses have cut it off from its herd. My heart felt like a drum, pounding out a signal that only she could understand. I felt disgusted by her rubbery flesh making a squeaking sound as she dragged herself half an arm's distance towards me. But at the same time, there was something about her, something alluring. She's beautiful. Dempsey's voice cracked through my ice form like a whip, and I felt it dissolve. Once I had half a second to collect myself, I realized it wasn't because he had spoken, but because her face had cut towards him with unnatural speed once he spoke. Her expression changed, and I could see Dempsey's body relax as her face honed in on him. He had climbed off me now and seemed like he would reach towards her. "Dempsey, don't." Tiny voice reigns supreme. "Dempsey, don't you hear it, Ripley?" He continued to reach, his face entranced. I still don't know why I didn't grab him, stop him. I was so horrified by what was happening in front of me, it was like being outside of my body watching it happening. Screaming at myself to do something. Screaming at myself to make my limbs work. Make my hands grab him and stop him. "I don't hear anything," was all I managed to squeak out. I can only describe what happened next as, have you ever seen an alligator attack on a nature movie? The unbelievable way they burst out of the water and grab their prey? The supernatural speed they seem to be able to execute that moment when their dinner is just close enough to execute a killing strike. That was what it was like. It was like watching an alligator attack my brother, with more speed and strength than I could have ever imagined. She lunged at him with such force that it propelled her off the deck and straight into his chest, knocking him back over the top of me. The sounds she made while razor-sharp teeth and claws made short work of my handsome brother's dashing looks were unlike anything I think any person has ever heard. Unlike a human or an animal. I had never gotten up, and when she launched herself into him, he was propelled back off me, but a length of her body pinned me down as she ravished him. But more horrifying than any of the sounds she made, and then the feeling of her body writhing on top of me as she killed him, was the sound Dempsey made. He managed to say it 3 times before she had completely dismantled his face and throat. And he made no more sounds. "She's beautiful?" I never even realized Dad kept a laptop on the boat. I found it on accident actually. Trying to find the rudimentary med kit that I faintly remembered being on the boat somewhere. I don't even know why I bothered looking for the kit. I knew Dempsey was dead before she had slithered off the top of him. Over the railing and back into the sea. I knew I couldn't find the kit, but I found Dad's laptop. And my phone has a local hotspot. I have great service here. Actually, I'm stunned. I almost called the police, but what do I tell them? That my brother captured a fucking mermaid and she ate his face and ripped out his throat before jumping back into the ocean? They will never believe that. I'm soaked in his blood from trying to help him. You can all imagine what this looks like. What do you guys think I should do? Story. I used to work night security at a zoo. Damn. Dirty apes. Ronnie cursed into the radio. What's going on out there? I asked, giving his quote a chuckle. I could hear the shrieking of the baboons in the background. The storm came down worse than the pretty weather girl said on the television earlier that night. In fact, it was the complete opposite. The wind gusts blew through the zoo accompanied by torrents of cold, thick rain. She said it was supposed to become a drizzle in the next couple's hours, yet it was intensifying. They're really agitated tonight. I don't know what the fuck is wrong with them. Ronnie answered back, must be the storm. It's probably going to get worse before it gets better. Animals have a sixth sense about them. You know, they know when the shit is about to hit the fan. I said back to him and lowered the radio volume. Oh come on. You know that's some pseudoscience bullshit. Ronnie shouted as I expected he would. It was easy getting under his skin when it came to stuff like that. He had no tolerance for bullshit, and that's part of the reason why we got along so well. We had plenty of time to get to know each other while working the day shift, and often walked around the zoo shooting the shit while telling the visitors not to feed the animals and occasionally dealing with an obnoxious or drunken patron. Everything changed the day after the first incident at the zoo. Several animals were found eviscerated in their enclosures and some were missing altogether. Security was ramped up in response, forcing us to man the night shift until the police could figure out what had happened. Neither of us minded being reassigned since our pay was slightly increased and we wouldn't be dealing with the nasty heat in the daytime. Best of all, there weren't any visitors in the zoo. I'm kidding. Buddy, relax, I said, adding fuel to the fire. Fuck you, Al, Ronnie shouted and cut out. I walked underneath the awning near a row of snack stands staying out of the rain. I felt bad for Ronnie since there was nothing on his side of the zoo besides restrooms that would offer shelter from the rain. Hey Ron, why don't you hide out in the bathroom for a while until this shit blows over? Give him a good cleaning while you're at it, I suggested. Shut up, Ronnie replied in a whisper. Oh come on, I'm just trying to help, I replied back, laughing that I'd gotten under his skin again. No seriously, be quiet a sec, Ronnie commanded in a serious tone. In the time we'd worked together, I'd never heard Ronnie be serious about anything. I waited for what felt like hours for him to radio back. I was about to squeeze the call button when the crackle of radio static startled me. Get the fuck over here now, Ronnie shouted frantically. What is it? I answered back. Seriously man, whatever you're doing just drop it and get the fuck over here now. You gotta see this. Ronnie's voice wavered in the static of the radio. Though I was cold and soaked to the skin. I felt colder still when I heard him speak those last words. I'd never heard his voice waver like that. I'd never heard that undercurrent in it that couldn't be disguised. Fear. Be over there ASAP. Sit tight. The radio crackled and I headed from the shelter of the snack stands back to the parked golf cart. The plastic roof of the vehicle did little to shelter the console from the pouring rain. Everything was soaked and dripping. I hopped in and turned the key, my hand shaking from the cold. I buzzed away in the silent vehicle, along the black pavement of the zoo paths toward the primate enclosures where Ronnie awaited. The grounds were empty and quiet, much too quiet. Why in God's name did we have to work on a night like tonight? Why couldn't we just stay in the office until this shit blew over? And now this nonsense with the apes. The thoughts buzzed in my head and more I began to weigh how much I actually needed this job. When I arrived at the baboon enclosure, Ronnie stood by the edge of the cage, his plastic poncho flapping in the wind behind him like some kind of comic book superhero. I slammed the brakes hard and brought it to a dead stop behind him. But he didn't turn around. The shrieking of the primates was frenzied, high-pitched and perpetual, and set my teeth on edge. They couldn't have been too happy about being stuck out in this god-awful weather. But I got the feeling from what my partner had said it was something more than that. I hopped from the seat of the cart and lightning flashed in the sky, followed by a boom of thunder. Low, loud, and close. The baboons shrieking intensified and I felt like I was walking into that scene from 2001. I expected to see a giant black obelisk rising from the center of their cage. I came up beside my coworker. Ronnie, what the hell's going on? Man, what's got into them? He still didn't turn his head. The pouring rain ran down his cheeks as he stared into the center of the cage. I followed his gaze and saw a swarm of the shrieking monkeys encircling something. They were feeding, tearing pieces of flesh and blood and ligament from an animal torso lying between them. Ronnie just kept staring his 1,000-yard stare. "It's human," he said slowly. "There's a human body in there." I felt ill as I glanced around the top of the enclosure. I figured that whoever's body was being torn asunder by a frenzied troop of baboons had gotten in from up there. There was an altogether too short railing at the top that opened up into the main level of the park. During the day, people could come and watch the baboons play from above instead of below. A few times in the past, there had been a few idiots who decided that they wanted to climb the railing to play with the baboons. There was only one time someone had successfully made it into the enclosure, but the guards were able to rescue them before the baboons got to them. This person hadn't been so lucky. "What the hell are we going to do?" Ronnie said blankly, staring at a rather large baboon leisurely chewing on a handful of flesh. I stood unblinking and uncertain of the best course of action. Obviously, we couldn't go in. Getting between a wild animal and its meal is inadvisable. And really, there was no point. The person in there was deader than disco. Risking our lives for a corpse wasn't a reasonable course of action. Especially because we didn't get paid enough for that. "We better call the boss," I said, turning toward the exit of the exhibit. "I think we should just call the cops right away," Ronnie said to me as we made our way back to the small office where our phones were protected from the rain. The boss had told us clearly after the first couple of incidences that we should contact him first. He'd take care of it. Something about us not getting paid enough to deal with this shit. He was right, reminding Ronnie of this. He didn't seem pleased. He started quietly grumbling under his breath, spitting the rainwater from his mouth with every movement of his lips. Grabbing my phone, I sifted through to find George. After several rings, his wife answered the phone. Her quiet hello sounded groggy from being awoken. "Hi, Mrs. S. Is George around? There's been another incident." My voice cracked. "It's pretty serious." She yawned. "Hi, Al. George said he was going into work tonight. Something about a problem with the security system. You haven't seen him?" Placing my hand over the receiver so she couldn't hear me, I spun around to Ronnie, who was looking a little pale. "You seen George tonight?" He simply shook his head. "We haven't. I'll keep an eye out." She yawned again. "All right, dear. You two be careful in that storm." The only option now was to notify the cops. I didn't like it, but damned if we were going to go searching for George in the storm. Ronnie seemed relieved, more color flooding to his face. "I'll call them," he said. "All right, I don't want to, but I'll head back to the enclosure to make sure everything is secure," I said as Ronnie started dialing. The office was close by and I could still hear the monkeys shrieking. I made my way to the top of the enclosure to double-check the locks on the doors. Realizing they were secure, I sighed and put my weight on the rail, tilting my head to the left in an attempt to not look down. My focus fixated on one of the trees, and that's when I noticed the piece of clothing that had been left behind. A few years back, George had gone on a trip with his wife. He came back with a red cap which seemed to be superglued to his head ever since. My stomach dropped and I sprinted back to the office. Flinging open the door, I yelled out to Ronnie. I think it was George. "Fuck, Ron." His hat was in the enclosure. Ronnie froze with his thumb hovering over the call button, staring into the space I occupied. He blinked. "No fucking way." I sighed. "Yeah, way. I can hardly believe it myself. No, I mean, no fucking way. George never went near those things. You know, those damn dirty apes? He hates them." His hat was hooked on one of the branches with smears of brown and deep red. Apart from that, there was no way to identify the mess of viscera lying in the bottom of the enclosure now. His hat was in there. "Ron." He shook his head with a little too much conviction. "That don't mean a thing. Coulda fallen off. Then maybe the wind blew it in there." Ron hit call and put the phone to his ear. I slumped in the chair next to him, barely listening to his requests for police and an ambulance. I shut my eyes for just a minute when the sound of the rain became cracks against the window. Hailstones fell and littered the ground with pale icy beads. By the time Ron explained for the third time that we were on 5th and 8th, not 6th and 7th, the hailstones were as big as golf balls and slammed against the window, threatening to come straight through. The cries from the park changed from excited gibbering to panicked shrieks. The lemurs in the enclosure next to the office ran around trying in vain to hide under the trees. Hailstones crashed down against the bars, exploding into fragments. Some got through the gaps and hit the ground inside like grenades. The unlucky animals took direct hits, some reeling from broken ribs, some slumped to the ground with a bloody mess on their skull. The ones that found hiding places fought for the space, pushing smaller, weaker ones into the fray. Shit, Ron hung up. I could barely hear them on the line. The dispatcher didn't hear a word of what I said. This storm is seriously fucking with us. I think we're in here for the night. Ron. As the words came out of my mouth, there was a crash above us. It thudded heavily like it would break through the roof. The office shook with the impact. Then there was another one and another afterward. Ron and I both jumped out of our seats and stared up at the ceiling, expecting it to come crashing down on us at any moment. Those pieces of hail must be the size of freaking basketballs to make that noise. I said to Ron as we both went to the office door and into the administrative area. As we approached the window for a look outside, there are several more crashes on the roof. Neither of us said a word at what we saw when we looked out the window. Dozens of animal corpses littered the pavement outside the office as far as we could see. We couldn't tell what any of them were. Each corpse was a tangled mess of flesh and viscera. Broken bones ripped through skin and fur. They looked just like George's body in the baboon enclosure. Ron put his head down and puked. I was too in shock to do anything else but stare ahead and watch as animals continued to fall from the sky. It's fucking raining all creatures great and small of God's green earth. Ron looked up at me, his face pale, and wiped the vomit from the edge of his mouth with his hand. He stared at me incredulously. The pounding on the roof continued above us. A continual thump, thump, thump. I stared out the window and watched the rain of animal corpses hitting the pavement. Body after body rained from the sky with the hail. Giant fleshy sacks of muscle and blood and grizzled guts exploding against the hard wet surface of the zoo asphalt and splattered everywhere. I'm worried the roof is gonna come in, Ronnie said. His eyes were wild. This is some end times shit we're dealing with right now. Man, His proclamations were cut short by a sound coming from outside. It was a viscous, bone-rattling monstrous squawk that was deeper and louder than any boom of thunder I'd ever heard. What the fuck was that? I said. We need to get out of here. No, Ronnie yelled. What the fuck's got into you? Man, it's fucking raining animals outside. I didn't care. I ran for the door and burst out into the cold insanity that was the storm. It was a wasteland of carnage. Animal bodies strewn everywhere, and the unrelenting hail and wind pounded me. Then I heard it again. That animal sound. That scream. Shaking me to the core and making a chill run up my spine. Ow! Ronnie yelled from behind and tackled me. We fell to the tarmac, and I looked just in time to see a giant hulking gorilla drop like a stone and explode into a puddle of gore right where we had been standing. Holy shit! I yelled over the thump 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 of bodies hitting the pavement everywhere around us. Thanks, man. Ronnie was frozen above me, staring up into the sky. Ronnie? I followed Ronnie's gaze. At first I thought he was staring at the storm. Then lightning flashed and I saw what he was looking at. It was only for a moment, but whatever I saw was huge. Flying on massive wings. Now that I knew it was there, I could see it. Turning round and round in the sky. It was circling the mess of meat that had just splattered behind us. I glanced down at myself and realized that Ronnie and I were covered in the gore too. Ronnie, I choked out, trying to remain calm. Ronnie, we have to get back inside. Ronnie still had his eyes glued to the sky. He was whimpering prayers to whatever deity he worshipped. Ronnie, damn it. I stood up and grabbed his arm and began yanking him towards the building. We need to get back inside now. I heard the creature getting closer, the wings shaking the air, warning that death was only a few yards away. I could feel the beating of the wings in the shifting of the air. It squawked again, and I dropped Ronnie's arm to cover my ears. I looked at Ronnie again. He'd finally come around and was standing. The squawk seemed to shake him loose from his paralysis. I took that chance to bolt for the door. "Hurry up!" I shouted to Ronnie while he was still making his way back into the building. He slipped on the gore that covered the ground, almost falling over, but regained his balance as he bolted towards the door. A flash of lightning lit up the sky, and then there was the crash of thunder a moment later. Ronnie's eyes widened into pure terror. Another powerful squawk ripped across the air, making my ears' drums feel as if they were going to burst. Whatever it was that he saw gave him a second wind, and he quickly made it back inside. I slammed the door shut behind him and twisted the lock into place. The door started to shake a second later, as if a group of people were hitting it with hammers. The sound of wood splintering ran out through the office, and an ear-piercing squawk filled my soul with fear. I had no time to think as the window next to the door shattered and something flew into the administrative room. The impact must have dazed it as it fluttered around on the ground, trying to regain its composure. I felt a tug on my arm, and Ronnie dragged me away into the security room. "Did you see that shit?" I shouted, knowing damned well that Ronnie had seen it. There were 1,000,001 questions on my mind. My adrenaline rush wouldn't allow me to formulate the words that I was trying to say. I was hoping he would have some sort of an answer that would put my mind to ease as to what that creature was. "The sky, it's full of them," Ronnie replied through chattering teeth. I couldn't tell if it was from being cold or from fear. "I only saw the huge one and the one in the office," I said back, confused. "I saw them all when the lightning flashed. They're circling above us. Hundreds of them," Ronnie explained. A cold shiver went up my spine. Ronnie sat down on a chair and put his palms to his face. He wiped away the blood that was getting into his eyes. I did the same, hoping to remove whatever I had on my face as well. "Coco," Ronnie said, as if figuring out the answer to all our questions in life. "What about Coco?" I replied. "Dude, that was Coco that splattered in front of us on the pavement," Ronnie answered with wide eyes, nodding his head in a daze. "Yeah, there were a lot of animals out there. The whole fucking zoo is splattered outside," I replied, still not understanding where he was going with it. "Coco is a 300-pound gorilla," Ronnie said, looking at me like I was an idiot. "I really don't know how that fun fact helps us right now," I said, feeling irritated. Whatever the fuck it was that dropped him from the sky has to be about the size of a goddamned bus to have done that. Ronnie shouted at me while tossing the chair to the side and pacing around the room. He opened the desk drawers and ransacked them until he found a can of mace and tossed it at me. "So what do we do now?" I asked, hoping to calm him down. "We barricade the door, hunker down, and hope to God that they don't break through," Ronnie replied while turning over the desk and pushing it against the door. I started to search the room for something else to add to our makeshift barrier and found nothing. We took our chairs and placed them against the door too. We both sat there listening to the thump 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 and muffled squawks between the rumbles of thunder. Blank. Underscore. Blank. "Al, wake up," Ronnie said, shaking me out of my slumber. I didn't realize that I had fallen asleep. Between the sound of thunder and squawks, I didn't think I'd ever get to sleep, but my exhaustion must have won out at some point in the night. "What's going on?" I asked, wiping the sleep away from my eyes. The whites of Ronnie's eyes were bloodshot and there were bags under his eyes. He must have stayed awake the entire night. "It's morning. The storm is gone. There hasn't been a thump on the roof in hours. I think it's safe, but I don't want to chance going out there without backup," Ronnie explained, pointing at the mace on the floor next to me. We made our way out of the security office, remaining as quiet as we could. Ronnie led in front, holding an improvised spear made from a broom handle we'd found in the closet. I stayed behind him with the mace ready to spray anything that came at us. As soon as we stepped out of the office door, the smell of rotting meat punched us in the face like we owed it money. I tried to hold back from vomiting, but the smell was too wretched. I tossed up whatever I had in my stomach, and then we continued onward with our hands over our noses and made sure to breathe through our mouths. It didn't make it any better. As we exited the hallway and entered the administrative office, we were met with the sound of squawking birds. That almost sent me running back into the security office, but Ronnie held my arm and told me to listen. They were nothing like the squawking we heard the night before. We tiptoed to the shattered window, crunching over the broken glass, alerting the birds to our presence. A few turned their attention to us, then immediately went right back to enjoying their scavenged meal. They paid no mind to us as we took in the grisly view that the darkness of the night had hidden away from our eyes. Thousands of birds from miles around had smelled the stench of festering zoo animals and came to enjoy the buffet of leftovers the creatures from last night left behind. Entire carcasses were left behind that looked like they had been torn apart, but none of the meat was taken. Only the bones seemed to have been removed. Birds of all shapes, colors, and sizes pecked away with blood-smeared beaks at the carrion. Before leaving the safety of the office, we searched the skies for any sign of the creatures from last night. Aside from a few birds circling above, there was nothing threatening. We made our way out to the parking lot carefully to avoid slipping on the gore that coated the ground. Once I got my phone on a charger, I called for the police and told the dispatcher about what happened. I couldn't believe my ears when they told me that they would get to us in an hour or two. The storm had wrought havoc across the state, causing traffic accidents and bringing down power lines, making travel very difficult. All officers on duty were busy. Ronnie took the phone from me and tried to berate some sense into the dispatcher, but apparently even if every animal on Earth was killed, the police would still be more worried about taking care of human life first. Looking back on it now, I can see their reasoning, but after spending the night in a security office worrying about being lifted into the air and then dropped to my death by some monster, there was no reason left in the world. We waited an hour before an officer showed up at the zoo. As he stepped out his car, he placed his hand over his nose and coughed at the smell in the air. It was beginning to warm up too. The smell would get worse as the day went on. The officer asked us what happened, and we had no choice but to tell him the truth. He didn't believe us until we offered him a tour of our newly renovated zoo. Once he finished puking, he called for backup. I imagine that the rest of the day must have been like that for everyone else that showed up at that horrific scene. It's been almost 12 years since the events of that horrible night. The zoo never reopened, and a month later, It was bulldozed and the land was sold off to a company that built a warehouse there. Ronnie and I heard through the grapevine that the zookeepers and everyone else that worked there were told that it was closed because the owners had a change in morality about keeping animals caged up for human amusement. They were told that the animals were released into the wild or transferred to other zoos around the world. Any further inquiries led nowhere. The company offered very generous severance packages to the employees that lost their jobs. Ronnie and I were offered a substantial amount to compensate us for our troubles that night and to buy our silence. Non-disclosure agreements were a stipulation to getting our payouts and keeping them. Unfortunately, money talks, and it's very loud in the ears of a couple of guys that used to work security in a zoo. Plus, who was going to believe our story anyway? George's wife was the only loose end that the company had to contend with. She filed a missing persons report with the local police, and there was an investigation into his disappearance. The last anyone had seen of him was a security camera video showing him getting a drink at a convenience store and leaving the store never to be seen again. George never turned up. It pained me to have to keep my mouth shut about it, knowing that she was suffering the entire time. Luckily for her, it was discovered later on that George had a life insurance policy through the zoo, and Mrs. S got a pretty huge payout. She soon went silent on the matter as well. A few months after George disappeared, she moved out of town, never to be seen or heard from again. Just to be safe, I changed the names of the people involved and left out many of the specifics in case anyone from the company's legal department happens to stumble upon this. After more than a decade, I doubt anyone even bothers thinking about that zoo anymore except for me, and I'd guess that Ronnie may think about it often as well. There are still scars from that night that will last me a lifetime. The sound of thunder sends a cold chill down my spine and sends me running for cover in a panic. I've imagined seeing the outline of the mammoth beast circling in the clouds, waiting for me to come outside so that it can fly me into the air and drop me. The deafening squawk is the only that I can hear as I plummet to earth. My bones snap on impact and everything goes dark, but I'm not dead. The smell of rotting animals awakens me from death. I see the birds pecking away with bloody beaks at the remains of splattered animals. I can't breathe. I can't think. Nothing feels right anymore. Once it passes, I'm fine again, and I can continue to live my life as I have all along, with only one lingering thought in the back of my head that continues to haunt me to this day. They're still out there. One day, those creatures will be hungry again. And the next time, they'll be bigger and looking to eat animals more like Coco instead of baboons. Story. I got invited to an obscure, experimental concert. It changed my life forever. I saw another one today. It was spray painted above the entrance to a sewer, along with an arrow pointing downward into the darkness. 20 years later, MVSH is finally back in town. MVSH. 4 little letters. I know it's stupid to be scared of them. Just as I know that no one is likely to remember me as the person I was 20 years ago. None of that helps when the memories come flooding back. The summer I turned 17. My life was about music, grimy basement mosh pits, drunken field concerts where the amps were plugged into some survivalist's gas generator, night drives with the windows down and the radio blaring. A part-time job at Sundown Records paid bums to buy beer for me and kept my gas tank needle half an inch from empty. My parents bit their nails about my future. But I didn't care. Why shouldn't life just go on like this forever? Working at Sundown Records had another perk as well. I got to spend time with Dylan Fuse. He was a big name in the local underground scene, and his music shop reflected it. The walls were covered with the concert flyers of bands he'd discovered and made great. The high-end sound system played only music that met his own exacting standards. My interview at Sundown was just to listen to 3 songs and tell Dylan what I thought of them. When I told him I thought they all sucked, a polished white smile flashed across his face. He put his crocodile skin shoes up on his desk and told me that the job was mine if I wanted it. Dylan gave me tips on all the most exclusive shows. Even let me borrow albums from the shop. He was charming. He was worldly. And unlike the boys in my high school, he actually knew how to dress himself. It wasn't long before I was head over heels in love with him. That was how it started. I was breaking down cardboard boxes in the hallway beside his office when the phone rang. My heart skipped a beat. Nobody dared to call Dylan after 5 p.m. Not unless it was an emergency. I still remember the giddiness in Dylan's voice when I pressed my ear against the door to eavesdrop. Really? They are? I'll be there. Dylan burst out into the hallway just as I got back to my heap of cardboard. Big news. He was yelling. MVSH is playing this weekend. I'd missed a key word in there. It had sounded like his mouth had suddenly filled up with half-chewed meat. Dylan rolled his eyes at my blank expression. Apparently, MVSH was the hottest thing on the scene right now. No one knew who the band members were, where they were from, or even how to pronounce their group's name. MVSH didn't even sell tickets to their concerts. The only way in was to show up with a specific food item. It served as proof that you had been told about the show by someone close to the band. I nodded along to Dylan's story, not trusting myself to speak. When I was alone with him, my words tangled themselves into stupid, humiliating knots. I always wound up talking to my shoes, and half the time I had no idea what I had actually said to him. I was thinking about how unfair that was when I realized that Dylan had just invited me to go see MVSH with him. Sure, I guess. I finally managed to shrug. My boss must have seen right through my attempt to look careless. There was a sneer on his face as he peered out into the shop. He wanted to make sure no one overheard what he was about to say next. I got goosebumps as he leaned in close and whispered, "Well, then, there are a few other things you're going to need to know." I had it all planned out. I waited until my father had finished 3/4 of his coffee and reached the sports section of the newspaper before I asked him if I could stay over with my friend Sarah on Friday night. We had a biology exam on Monday. I lied, and Sarah wanted to study together. My father glanced up sharply, and I knew I was busted. I had been an idiot to suggest that I cared about school. He knew me better than that. He gazed out the window, brushed some crumbs off of his tie, and sighed. "Sure, honey, you can go, but you're bringing Raquel," trying to hide the horrified expression on my face. I gave him a quick hug and bolted out the door. This was going to ruin everything. The difference between my sister Raquel and I was clear just by looking at our notebooks. Hers were neat, detailed, each perfectly shaped letter contained inside the lines. Mine were jumbled and chaotic, filled with stickers, doodles, and my friends' phone numbers. If I tried to leave Raquel alone at Sarah's, she would rat me out for sure. My only option was to bring her to see MVSH as my guest and hope that I could convince her to follow Dylan's bizarre instructions. The afternoon before the concert, we raided the heaps of donated clothes in the Methodist church basement. We were searching for the ugliest, filthiest stuff we could find. Dylan said that MVSH didn't let anyone in unless they looked like they had been sleeping in a dumpster for a few weeks. I told Raquel that we could throw everything away after the concert anyway. Gross. My sister made a face. I took a deep breath and did my best to explain to Raquel that seeing MVSH live was a life-changing experience. Did she really think that Dylan Hughes would be wrong about something like that? If she did, she kept her mouth shut about it, finally settling on a pair of paint-splattered khaki pants and a greasy orange t-shirt. The jeans and tuxedo vest that I'd picked out for myself were in tatters. But at least they fit me and, sort of, matched. I was especially proud of a leather belt I discovered in a dusty corner beneath some trash bags. Its steel buckle was brick-heavy and handmade in the shape of a grinning skull. Now there was just one last stop to make before we caught a bus to the location that Dylan had given me. "What's with the soup?" Raquel asked later, when she saw me pocketing 2 packets of bouillon cubes at the mini-mart across from the bus station. I repeated Dylan's instructions. When you go to a MVSH concert, you've got to bring something that shows you know somebody cool. You know, like a password. This time, it's chicken soup cubes. We got lucky. Dylan says that one year it was oatmeal, and last time, it was pig's blood. Hey, Raquel hurried after me, whispering, "You're going to pay for that, right?" I got us a coin locker across from some broken down payphones. As we stored our stuff, I reminded Raquel that she couldn't bring anything into the show with her. No wallet. No phone. Nothing. For punks. These guys sure have a lot of rules. Raquel complained but handed over her shoulder bag anyway. When the bus arrived, Raquel sat in the front seat, her spine straight and her hands folded neatly in her lap. I lounged beside her, drumming my fingers impatiently on the windows and hoping she wouldn't realize how nervous I was. I had assumed that Dylan would be fine with me inviting one extra person, but what if he wasn't? Our stop was near the end of the line, its crazily leaning sign barely visible in the amber streetlight glow. I was expecting some gritty industrial club with steel shutters and a line of leather-clad hipsters at the door. But the sidewalk was empty. The factories and warehouses looming over us were either closed down or partly demolished. Mangy cats prowled through the weed-choked lots. The only sign of life was a pair of white semi-trucks backed up against one of the decrepit buildings. For the first time, I found myself doubting my boss's intentions. What if Dylan was just toying with me? What if the whole thing was just some kind of cruel joke? Raquel and I slipped through a gap in a chain-link fence, then turned down a blind alley. At the far end, MVSH was spray-painted above a rusted factory door. A crowd had already started to gather. Their clothes were just ragged as ours. And there was a packet of bouillon cubes in every hand. I spotted Dylan's silky smooth hair right away. We had made it. As my boss approached, that feeling of relief vanished. Without his expensive clothes and soft lighting of the record shop, Dylan looked old. He licked his lips when he saw me, and suddenly I wanted to puke. I wondered what an adult man was doing inviting a teenage girl to an event like this. Then wondered why it had taken me so long to ask that question in the first place. The hungry expression on his face soured when he saw Raquel at my side. "Who's this?" "My sister Raquel. I specifically told you that there's only one invite per guest." "Right, you invited me, and I invited my sister." I found myself getting angry on Raquel's behalf. Who did Dylan think he was? She had just as much of a right to be here as anyone else. "If it's a problem, we can just leave." "No, no problem." Dylan clearly still thought he had a chance. He looked at Raquel's outfit and snorted. "Just act like you don't know me when you get to the door." "Okay, that won't be hard," Raquel snorted. There was a sarcastic edge to her voice that I had never heard before. And it occurred to me that maybe my sister was more than just the whiny teacher's pet that I had always believed her to be. Maybe during these long years of high school, she had changed, too. A breeze blew down the alley, carrying dust, ripped up plastic bags, and soggy newspaper pages. One of them stuck to Dylan's pants and he pried it off with 2 fingers as though it were some disgusting laboratory experiment. "So do these guys always keep their audience waiting forever?" Raquel asked. "Or are we special?" Dylan, usually so glib and sarcastic in his office, suddenly had nothing to say. At the far end of the alley, the factory door opened with a metallic screech. We all clapped, even Raquel, but our cheers died in our throats when we saw the 6 hulking figures that walked out of it. If they were bouncers, they were the most intimidating security team that I had ever seen. It wasn't just how eerily similar they all looked. With their bald heads and pale skin, it wasn't even how large they were. It was their eyes. There was no emotion in them at all. The 6 of them were surveying the crowd like we were cattle waiting to be processed. I had been to concerts with sketchy security, sometimes motorcycle gangs or ex-convicts, but this was different. Something was wrong. Before I could express what I was feeling to Raquel, the line started to move. The 6 strangers were even more disturbing up close. Something about their pasty skin reminded me of cold porridge or graying meat left out to spoil. Their outfits were made of stitched together strips of ragged old clothing that looked a lot like ours. 2 of them were scanning the concert goers with metal detecting wands. Raquel gripped my arm. "I have a phone," she whispered. "What?" I snapped. I wasn't worried about not getting in. I was concerned about what those pale strangers might do to us if we gave them an excuse to do it. Dylan had made it clear that MVSH was ruthless about enforcing their weird rules. And if they dragged this out of line here in an industrial wasteland far from any help, anything might happen. Dad said I couldn't go unless I brought it. I bit my lip and held out my hand to Raquel. "Hand it over." Using Dylan's broad back as cover, I slipped my sister's cell phone down the front of my pants. If it triggered the metal detectors, I could just point to the steel belt buckle that was covering it. They wouldn't investigate further, I hoped. The closer we got to the 6 of them, the less confident I felt. Those beady black eyes never seemed to blink, and there was a smell to them, something irony and astringent that I couldn't quite identify. Raquel looked over her shoulder at me as rough hands separated us. Their metal detecting wands moved over our bodies. Raquel disappeared through the lightless factory door just as my belt buckle set off a horrible electronic whine. The large figure in front of me pointed wordlessly at it, forcing my mouth into a sheepish smile. I took the buckle off for closer inspection. As I did, I shook the phone further down my pant leg. The strangers passed the buckle around, then handed it back to me. Their metal detectors passed over my hips and thighs, but there was nothing there to trigger them anymore. Looking almost disappointed, they waved me through. I couldn't see anything, but from the way the crowd pressed up against me, I guessed we were in some kind of corridor. I called out to Raquel, but she didn't respond. I had an awful feeling that if I stopped or stubbled, I would be trampled to death by a mass of shuffling hipster feet. Everyone had gotten over the shock of the 6 strangers at the door. People murmured and shoved each other forward, eager to see what MVSH had in store for them next. We filed out into a much larger space, and stage lights came on above. It was a sort of square room that had been set up on the factory floor, with solid metal walls that were about 3 times my height. The stage hung overhead, casting fractured shadows onto the excited faces around me. When MVSH walked out on stage, the applause was scattered. The band members were the same 6 grim, burly figures who had been working security outside. What the hell was going on? A hairy hand squeezed my shoulder and I jumped. Dylan was right behind me. He kept jabbing his finger at the walls and shouting something, but the band had already started playing. I couldn't have heard him even if I'd wanted to. It was easy to lose him in the crowd. Dylan had been right about one thing. I had never heard anything like MVSH before. When they began their first set, the droning buzz felt like I had stuck my head into a hornet's nest. The chug 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 of the bass reminded me unnervingly of chomping teeth. People glanced at the faces around them, unsure. Was this really the band we had all gone through so much trouble to see? Despite their doubts, the crowd began to dance along to the music, probably hoping, like I was, that what we were hearing was just a build-up to something less disturbing. I bounced and swayed along with the rest of them. I wanted to lose myself in the music, to forget about the sense of unease that Dylan's wild-eyed expression had left me with. I kept seeing the same face as I moved through the audience, which was more tightly packed than ever, but there was no sign of Raquel. That nagging sense of wrongness was getting stronger and stronger. Sprinklers switched on overhead, soaking us all with oily, lukewarm water. The dance floor filled with the out-of-place cozy scent of chicken broth. The bouillon cubes we'd all brought with us were dissolving. The nasty liquid puddled around our feet, making the metallic walls and floor even more slick than they already were. Someone threw a shoe at the band. I was no longer the only one looking around anxiously for an exit. About half the crowd was loving it, or at least they had convinced themselves that they were. They slam danced in a sweaty, frenzied mosh pit just below the stage, oblivious to the creeping claustrophobia that the rest of us felt. That was where I finally spotted Raquel, spinning her wet hair and pumping one fist above her head. She was having the time of her life. The hipster beside me bumped into me. He blinked, wiped water from his expensive glasses confusedly, then turned back to the band. It didn't make sense. We had both been standing still. No one had slammed into us or forced us to collide with one another, which left only one explanation. The room was somehow getting smaller. Was that what Dylan had meant when he had pointed to the walls? That they were moving somehow? Squeezing through all those slimy bodies to reach my sister probably took just a few minutes. But it felt like it took hours. Raquel threw her arms around me. I wasn't sure what she was screaming. But from her big grin I understood that she was thanking me for bringing her here. Her smile faded when she saw the worried look on my face. The way I kept pointing away from the stage, I tugged on Raquel's arm, but her slick skin slipped right through my fingers. She shook her head, and her disgusted glare showed me exactly what she was thinking. She had spent all those years studying, all those years being the good daughter while I went out and had fun, and now I was trying to drag her away from her first night out. Raquel shoved me away and started dancing harder than ever. The soup-reeking water was almost knee-high and rising. Up on stage, MVSH hammered on their instruments. Did they even know how to play them? Or were they just making as much noise as possible to cover the rumble of the engines hidden inside the walls? By the time Raquel and the rest of the audience realized what was happening, it would be too late. Sticky flesh and wet clothing pressed in on me from all sides. The claustrophobic feeling made me want to scream. And eventually, that's exactly what I did. My shrieking became so loud that I could almost hear it over the music. But nobody nearby paid me any attention. They were convinced that this was what they had come here to see. No matter how much I squirmed, I just couldn't move. Only when the pressure had pushed my belt buckle so deeply into my skin that it hurt did I think of the phone I had smuggled in with me. I twisted my arm until I could reach into my jeans and pull it free. The rectangular screen glowed like a lighthouse beacon on the dim dance floor. The band stopped playing. An angry cry rose from all sides. I had broken MVSH's rules. Through the wall of irritated faces I caught a glimpse of Raquel. Looking more furious than any of them, someone swatted at the device in my hand, and suddenly I was being shoved, lifted, pulled in all directions by a mob of strangers. I kept a death grip on the phone, fighting to punch 3 digits into the screen. 911. One of the MVSH members grabbed some long, cruel-looking tool that reminded me of a noose on a pole. It closed around my neck, dragging me backwards over all those angry, anonymous hands, onto the stage. I clawed helplessly at the rubber cord that was cutting off my air supply. The audience cheered. "Please let me go." I whimpered. 911. What's your emergency? A cheery voice blared from the phone's speaker. The crowd fell silent. The MVSH members looked at each other. One grabbed me by the arm and dragged me off stage. The others picked up their instruments, ready to continue their performance. "Hello? This is 911. Please state your emergency." The operator's words echoed eerily from the abandoned factory walls. I was being taken back out the corridor we had walked in through. Toward the alley door, the MVSH member tightened his grip around my bicep until I thought my arm would snap in half. He hadn't said a word, but the message was clear. He could beat me to death a long time before the police could arrive. Remain on the line, and first responders will. Oh geez, I apologized. I must have called by accident. I am so sorry. I hope the operator couldn't hear the quaver in my voice. There was a pause. Are you sure you're all right? Ma'am? No, I'm fine. I think I just rolled over in bed and hit a bunch of numbers on my phone. I lied. I'm not going to get in trouble for this. Am I? I mean, I'm still a teenager. The grip on my arm loosened and I backed out the rusted door. The MVSH member let me go but stayed within arm's reach, ready to pounce if I broke our unspoken deal. Not this time, ma'am, but you need to be more careful in the future. Click. The MVSH member's black eyes glared at me expressionlessly. I continued backing away, holding the glowing screen out in front of me like a magic amulet. I was ready to hit redial if he tried anything. And we both knew it. I have a sister in there. I began. If you could tell her. Another MVSH member came running out of the shadows, carrying that awful pole in his hands. I turned to run and felt the whoosh of the pole as it swept over my head and slammed into my wrist. Pain exploded in my hand. Raquel's phone shattered on the asphalt. I expected to hear chasing footsteps behind me, but instead, the steel-shuttered door slammed shut. It was like the pair had never been there at all. Deep within the guts of that abandoned factory, the concert was still going on, its unsuspecting audience being pressed tighter and tighter until, what? Until they were all crushed alive while the band played on above? I didn't want to think about it, because somewhere in that crowd was my sister. My wet clothes stuck to my skin, reeking of chicken broth and reminding me of what was happening back there. I had to get help, but finding my way through the winding alleys between the warehouses was taking forever, and even once I got back to the road, there was no one passing through this derelict district so late at night. Caught somewhere between exhaustion and panic, I waved my arms at anyone that passed by. The first car didn't stop. Neither did the second. After what felt like hours, a grizzled 50-something in a pickup truck pulled off the road, but he kept his hand on a glovebox pistol just in case. He didn't have a cell phone, but he would take me as far as a gas station where I could make a call. By the time my garbled story got out and the police closed in on the factory, it was almost dawn. MVSH, the two white semi-trucks, and their audience had vanished. With so many sudden disappearances, I had imagined that the case would make national news, but none of the journalists my family contacted were interested. After a while, I began to see their point. A traveling band that crushes its audience into goo? Not even the weirdest tabloids would consider running a story like that. The police said nothing about my sister's disappearance, only reassuring us that the investigation was ongoing. I started doing some digging of my own, and what I found was bizarre. Despite being such a supposedly phenomenal band, there was almost no information about MVSH online. What little there was got taken down almost as soon as it appeared. But even so, it was clear that I wasn't the only one who had lost a loved one to their deadly concerts. Someone on an anonymous forum claimed to have seen MVSH carrying plastic sacks of pink sludge into their white semi-trucks after one of their shows. Someone else said she found a heap of ripped, discarded clothing in the woods near where MVSH had performed. 2 days into my search, I began to receive bizarre, threatening messages. They were nothing but a jumble of letters and numbers, but scattered inside the chaos were eerie details. The name of the drink I had ordered at the coffee shop that morning. The address of the friend whose apartment I'd visited the night before. After that came the phone calls. There was never any voice on the other end of the line. Only a bunch of garbled noise and screams. It was the sound of a MVSH concert. As soon as I stopped investigating MVSH, the messages and phone calls stopped. Did I want to know what had really happened to my sister? Sure, but not enough to die for it. I learned to live with the past. I went back to school, eventually getting a doctorate in literature and taking a teaching position at a forgettable college in the Southeast. Bands don't even come through this state while they're on tour, much less this unimportant town. And yet 2 days ago, the music professor approached me in the cafeteria with an excited sparkle in his eye. A super experimental band was coming to town. He explained, one so exclusive that didn't even charge tickets for entry. All we had to do was bring a few spice packets, and they would put on a show that would change our lives forever. Story. I keep seeing hidden messages whenever I check the news. Someone's trying to tell me something. I spent more time than usual in the shower when I finally got home. It had been a long day. My mind felt foggy and exhausted. The hot water helped. Once I'd dried myself off, I headed downstairs for my nightly pre-bed ritual. Veg in front of the news. Catch up on the headlines. Then get some much-needed sleep. But today it was all wrong from the start. To begin with, the main news anchor was someone I'd never seen before. Some smug-looking blonde guy who introduced himself as Hugh Argleton. Must have been his first day, I guessed. Although if it was, he spoke with the confidence of someone who'd been doing the job a lot longer. Hugh rattled through the main global headlines, the ongoing political mess, escalating foreign tensions, but I wasn't really paying attention. I was waiting for the latest on a different story. A story closer to home. One that's pretty much been the only topic of conversation among my friends and colleagues over the past week. And sure enough, Hugh didn't disappoint. Swiveling in the chair behind his desk, he stared straight into the camera and cleared his throat. As he began speaking, I felt a familiar dread building in my stomach. Police are expanding their search for the so-called meat cleaver killer, after the body of a third victim was discovered late on Tuesday afternoon. This has been the latest in a string of horrific murders that have plagued them. I listened as Hugh Argleton reeled off the background to the case. I knew most of the facts already, ever since the first death had been reported on a road not far from our office. It had been all anyone could talk about. Theories about the killer, grim details not available in the papers, rumors of severed limbs and dissected bodies, non-stop gossip and updates, non-stop fear. I guess a serial killer is always going to be big talking point. But when the murders are happening in your area, it's different. You don't just feel like a distant observer anymore. You start to feel unsafe. It was as this thought crossed my mind that something happened. Something I was unable to explain. I couldn't make sense of it at the time. And I suppose I still can't. It made me feel like I might be losing my mind. The camera zoomed in for a close-up on Hugh Argleton's face. He stared back into it, his blue eyes unblinking. When he next spoke, it was as if he were addressing me directly. Police are advising residents in the area to take extra care when walking home, especially after dark, and to avoid quiet and poorly lit places at night. And if your name happens to be Sam, we'd advise you take extra care. Now, on to the weather. I blinked and stared at the screen. Had I really just heard what I thought I'd heard? Had Hugh Argleton just said my name? It couldn't be. Of course it couldn't be. I was tired. That was all. Exhausted from a long day. I'd been struggling to sleep lately, and it was probably just catching up with me. At least that's what I told myself. But no matter what excuses I made, something was wrong. I knew it was. The sense of dread I'd felt when Hugh Argletay began his broadcast sat in my stomach like a stone. I picked up the remote and flicked off the TV. Then, after a moment, I picked up my laptop. In the age of live streaming and catch-up, there was no need for me to overthink this. I'd obviously just misheard Hugh. And by going onto the news channel's online stream and rewinding it a bit, I'd be able to prove it. I navigated to the site and found the live feed. Dragged the little time marker back a couple of minutes as I watched Hugh Argletay launch into his roundup of the headlines again. I felt butterflies in my stomach, but not too many. I was pretty sure watching back the footage would set my mind at ease. It was a mistake. That was all. A simple case of tiredness and fear catching up with me. I'd heard something that wasn't really there. This time, as Hugh rounded off his segment on the meat cleaver killer, I leaned in close to the screen, watched as the camera zoomed in on his unsmiling face, and as he began giving his safety warning, I held my breath. Police are advising residents in the area to take extra care when walking home, especially after dark, and to avoid quiet and poorly lit places at night. And if you happen to be in the house on your own, then whatever you do, Sam, don't look under the bed. Now, on to the weather. I slammed the laptop shut, threw it on the sofa next to me. I was breathing fast, and I could feel my heart thumping in my chest. There were no excuses I could make this time. None. I'd listened carefully. I'd concentrated, and I was absolutely sure I hadn't misheard anything. Hugh's advice was different to the first broadcast, but it was clear enough. Whatever you do, don't look under the bed. From upstairs, I heard the soft creak of a floorboard. I froze. Every nerve in my body suddenly tingled. I held my breath and stayed as still as I could, straining my ears over the sound of my pounding heartbeat. Nothing. No more noises. No more creaks. You're imagining it. That's all. I told myself. All of it. It's just your tired mind playing tricks on you. But I suddenly found a horrible image pushing its way into my head. The image of a man upstairs, hiding in the darkness, his eyes and teeth glinting in the shadows beneath my bed, his fingers tightening around the wooden handle of a meat cleaver as he waited for the sound of my footsteps on the stairs. I shook the image off. My hands felt hot and sweaty as I picked up my phone in a desperate attempt to distract myself. My fingers slipped across its surface. I unlocked it on the third attempt. Had to wipe my right hand on my jeans before the thing would recognize my thumbprint. With the screen unlocked, I tapped on a random news app without thinking. A list of stories appeared in front of me. My eyes scanned down it. This was more like it. The top of the app was filled with entertainment news and celebrity gossip. Mindless stuff. As I scrolled down past the latest headlines, my heart rate gradually began to slow. I started feeling less afraid. But of course, it didn't last. About halfway down the page, I came across a headline that read, "Meat Cleaver Killer Claims Third Victim as Police Widen Search." I scrolled quickly past it, and as I did, that same creeping dread began to shift and roll in my stomach once more. Because it was happening again. The same inexplicable stuff I'd seen on the TV and on my laptop. The next headline that caught my eye was this: police advise residents who live alone to leave the house as quickly as possible. The one directly below it read, "Is the meat cleaver killer closer than you think?" And finally, just below that one, "Whatever you do, Sam, don't look under the bed." The name of that last article's author was Hugh Argleton. I locked my phone and placed it on the coffee table. My hands were shaking. Something fragile in my mind was starting to bend. It hadn't snapped, not yet. At least, but it was close. I could feel it, close to breaking point. And as I sat there on my sofa, I knew exactly what I needed to do. I had to go upstairs and check the bedroom. I had to do what the news was telling me not to. Because there was no man hiding under the bed, really. Was there? It was all in my mind. It had to be. It was paranoia brought on by fear and lack of sleep. I stood up and walked to the bottom of the stairs. They stretched up into darkness. My skin felt itchy with sweat. My heart beat like a trapped animal in a cage. I strained my ears for any sound upstairs, any more creaking floorboards, but I couldn't hear a thing. So I began to climb. The walk up the steps and down the hall to my closed bedroom door felt like a dream, a nightmare. I didn't want to go in that room. Not at all. I knew there was nothing to be afraid of, not rationally, but the thought didn't help. Dread consumed me, despite how I felt, though I couldn't see any alternative to confronting it head on. I took a breath and pushed open the bedroom door. It creaked inwards. My room was a nest of shadows. The curtains were drawn across the window, and the darkness made everything look sinister. My wardrobe and chest of drawers hunched in the blackness like monsters ready to pounce. I reached around the doorway, my hand shaking, and flicked the switch. Light spilled into the room. Its brightness made me squint. It banished most of the shadows, but not all of them. As I stood in the doorway, quickly scanning the area for any signs of movement, my eyes came to rest on the bed, at the slither of darkness just visible beneath it. My bed rested against the wall at the far end of the room. A nice big double. From my current angle, I couldn't see underneath it. Not properly. I knew I'd have to go in for a closer look. The floorboards creaked as I moved across the room. Each sound made me wince. The dread in my stomach rolled and churned. My mind continued to bend beneath an enormous weight of fear. And as I got closer to the bed, something started to happen. All the unusual things I'd heard and seen in the news began rushing through my head. A barrage of words and sounds. The longer it went on, the more a strange conviction grew in my mind that I was seeing the pieces of a puzzle I hadn't quite managed to fit together yet. A puzzle that it might be better if I didn't solve. If your name happens to be Sam, we'd advise you take extra care. Is the meat cleaver killer closer than you think? Whatever you do, don't look under the bed. The words whirled faster and faster in my mind. I was standing in front of the bed now. As the dread and terror inside me reached a crescendo, I lowered myself to my knees, and I peeked under it. Click. The final piece of the puzzle suddenly slotted into place. Hugh Argleton, the news anchor I'd never seen or heard of before. I said his name again in my mind, more slowly this time. Hugh Argleton. Hugh. A.R. Gle. Te. As I spoke the syllables and peered into the shadows beneath the bed, I felt a fragile part of my mind tear in two. There was no man hiding in the darkness. There was only a plastic bag, and as I reached into the shadows and grasped hold of it, I already knew what it contained. I pulled the bag out into the light, heard it scrape across the floorboards, took a breath and opened it. Inside was a stained meat cleaver and the bloody, severed stumps of 3 fingers. Story. I was a fake psychic. Now I'm not. Somebody posted this on Facebook a few weeks ago. They deleted it, but I grabbed the screen cap, thinking I could use it for marketing my shop. Guess this is as good a place as any to tell my story. It might be my last chance. Blank. Underscore. Blank. Fake is a strong word. My abilities are real, just not supernatural. There's skill in being a medium. The way I see it, I provide a service of intimacy and peace. A quiet hour in a jewel-toned, candle-lit room. A sense of assurance in a shaky world. Clients come to me to seek insight when they're unsure of the direction their lives should take. Mourners want to talk to their loved ones. Or, my client wants an indulgence of her vanity. Was she a royal figure in a past life? Does she have a unique aura? A subtle read of their personalities and mood. An intense gaze into their eyes. A few theatrics, and my customers leave happy. They pay me well for it. Personally, I'm not convicted in any particular belief, but I like seeing the meaning and comfort religion brings to my customers. That's why I set up shop here on Main Street 4 years ago. The store is called Magical Treasures. Some word of mouth and a paper mill doctorate in parapsychology later. And I became known as the local resource for seances and readings. We cater to all things superstitious. The relics in the store are organized by belief system, Catholic candles and holy water near the cash register, Wiccan spellbooks in the middle, and chakra crystals toward the back. Our marmalade shop cat, Voodoo, has a bed near the front window. Selling meditation bells doesn't pay the rent, but when you factor in the psychic consultations and workshops, I've done all right. It started last weekend. My client was Lucia, an elderly Italian woman, a regular. In addition to questions about her neighbors and grandchildren, she'd often ask where her deceased husband was, and whether he was watching her. About 15 minutes into the 30-minute reading, I started to feel faint. The lights in the dim room started to brighten and expand, and just as I was about to excuse myself, I faded out. Suddenly, I was back, sitting in the same position I was in before I passed out. Lucia's brown eyes were wide, staring at me. I felt Voodoo's fur slither across my calf as he walked by. "Lucia, I'm so sorry," I said. "I don't know what just happened. I must have passed out. I need some water." I started to stand. Lucia looked pale in the candlelight. "How did you know this? Did Angelo tell you?" I paused and sat back down. "Know what? You just told me about the day Angelo died. How I didn't call the ambulance until he was already gone, even though he begged me." "Wait, what? Is that true?" My heart beat faster. Lucia looked down. Her voice weakened. "He was so old. We married when I was 16. He was mean, and I was very tired." I looked at the clock. 15 minutes had passed since the start of my episode, and I didn't remember any of it. Blank. Underscore. Blank. After my experience with Lucia, I looked over my calendar. I had 5 more appointments between Sunday and Wednesday. This month has been slow. I couldn't cancel them. I didn't understand this newfound clairvoyance. But maybe it was a blessing. Secretly, I entertained the thought of being a genuine psychic. Maybe I could leverage it. Somehow, it continued to happen. Halfway through the reading, the spirit would take over. My clients were shocked at the accuracy. I tried to act nonchalant, even though I wasn't sure what I'd told them. On the last appointment, this afternoon, I came to discover my college-age client was sobbing. I touched her shoulder. She recoiled. "You told me I'll die." She said, "You told me I'll die within 3 months. And that I'll deserve it. Why did you tell me that?" "No." I breathed. "No, that's not true. Please don't cry." She paused, sniffled, and looked up at me. "Your eyes," she gasped. "They changed color. Just a minute ago, they were." Suddenly, the world faded again. When I came to, my client was gone. I drifted into the uneasy thought that I was losing control. If I'd ever had it at all. Blank. Underscore. Blank. It was about 6 o'clock this evening. I was startled by the sound of the delicate bells hanging over the door. It was Victor Wendell, the chair of the town movie theater's historical committee. His slim, wrinkled face appeared around the edge of the door. "Good evening, Dr. Reinhardt," he said. "The Riv is doing a 50-50 raffle. They're fundraising to restore the silent film projector. It's been snagging during some of the features. Damn near burned through a Harold Lloyd reel last month. You want in?" "No, thanks," I said. "I'm not really a gambler." He started to say something, then paused, a thoughtful look on his face. I was growing impatient and cross with his presence. "What, Victor? Your eyes are 2 different colors. Green and blue. I never noticed. How pretty." I blinked. He laughed and shook his head. "Or maybe it's just the light. Well, if you change your mind, we'll be selling tickets until Saturday." He winked and moved on to the next store with a cheerful gait. I sidled around the counter, latched the door, and turned the sign around to close. I raced to the jewelry display, which is backed by a mirror. I stared at my face. My eyes were different. What were they before? I remember them being greenish with bluish specks. Some blend of the 2 colors, but definitely not different from one another. Now, one was a solid, mossy green, the other crystal blue. I grabbed books from tables across the shop. Religious texts, spell books, and tales of the afterlife. At this point, I'm an equal opportunity believer. I poured through them, searching for answers. I used indices. I looked at tables of contents. And I flipped at random in an attempt to find something. Anything. As I approached the 1-hour mark, the lights in my shop started to glow and expand. No, I thought, not now. When I came to, the countertop in front of me was bare. The books I'd been reading had been pushed forward and were strewn on the floor. I felt wetness on my hands and looked down. They were covered with blood. There were fresh, bloody handprints throughout the store, on the counter, on the wall where I advertise my upcoming classes and reading slots. A firework of blood in front of the door trailed into a splotchy, dark red line across the carpet. I took a deep breath and followed it toward the back of the store. Oh my God, voodoo. By the blood and scratches on my forearms and the splatters on the carpet, I could tell the marmalade cat had tried to put up a fight. As I gently picked him up, his head dropped sickeningly toward the floor, neck broken. Every joint was disfigured, wrenched apart or cracked like a brute trying to get the last meat from a chicken wing. The spirit hadn't just killed him, he'd ripped him up. I looked around the store in a panic, hot tears burning my eyes. And that's when I saw it. While books were strewn everywhere, there was only one book that had been harmed. It was the Bible, which lay open and streaked with blood. Tiny, black and white fragments of delicate paper were strewn around the floor. I picked up the Bible and flipped through it. Only one page was ripped out and shredded. It was the one I'd been approaching as I blacked out. Desperate to find an answer, I searched the internet for the missing passages. I figured something in there had struck a nerve. There were a few verses that called to me, but I think I know what my monster was getting nervous about. Mark chapter 9 verse 47. And if your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out. It is better for you to enter into the kingdom of God with one eye than with two eyes to be thrown into hell. I can feel the ripper in my chest, bubbling up with morbid excitement. This is how it felt when it recognized the horror in Lucia's eyes. This is how it felt when it snapped Voodoo's legs between its fingers. It knows what I'm about to do, and it wants to watch. I don't have much here in the store, but I doubt I have time to do this right. I scoured the store and selected a Celtic sword-shaped letter opener, small, but sharp, and long enough to provide leverage. A lighter, my cell phone at my right hand. I'm taking a few deep breaths, and a healthy swig of the wine I have left over from the bachelorette party that was here last week. We'll do this by coin flip. Heads for green, tails for blue. Let's just hope I pick the right one. Story. I can smell lies. My name is Zachary Buchanan. I am 32 years old, and I can smell lies. Your first question might be if I'm crazy. I assure you, I am not. I have spent most of my adult life asking myself that same question. I am just like you. I work. I have a wife and a son. And I enjoy as quiet of a life as possible aside from my career choices. I don't like leaving my house. I spend lots of time in my office where I play video games. Your second question might be, what do lies smell like? Well, the best way I can describe it is it's like when my wife is curling her hair. That burnt, sharp smell, and let me tell you it's not pleasant. As a kid my pops used to say, "You have a real nose for this sort of thing," whenever my folks would lie about things like Santa, the Easter Bunny, even the Tooth Fairy. It made their job harder. But they were good parents. As an adult I found that my talent could help out a lot in law enforcement. I wanted to make the world better. And so when I graduated from the academy at 26, I took a job with my local PD where I spent the last 6 years trying to help as best I can. It's easy work if I'm being honest. Most folks you encounter you don't need a special sense to tell you when they're bullshitting you. I have made quite a name for myself here too, and am even the go-to guy during any information gathering we might do when we take people into custody. I hate the term interrogation. Feels so angry. I had just finished an interview with the Berkeley boy. I told the deputy his folks asked we put the fear of God in him, and he should learn not to take things that did not belong to him. The convenience store owner said he wouldn't press charges, and as far as I could tell other than paperwork, it was due to be a quiet night. I checked over the night shift's task list and swore at myself. We are accepting a transfer tonight. Well, there goes my hopes for a quiet night. The prisoner was one Claire Daniels, due to be kept under constant surveillance until she was transferred in the morning to Bedford Hills. I reviewed her file. Blank. That's strange. Must be an error with processing. I'll have to check with Lieutenant. No doubt he will be here if she's showing up tonight. Sure enough, his office lights were on. I stepped inside and gave the door a slight knock. L.T. Watkins was seated at his desk staring blankly at a glowing screen. He looked startled for a moment and said, "Oh, Buchanan. Just the man I wanted to see. Come on in. Have a seat." He gestured absently toward the chairs in front of his desk, not pulling his eyes from the screen. "Sir, I noticed we have a special guest tonight." Her file was blank though. I have to admit I'm curious. We don't get a lot of transfers, and certainly not ones that are making their way to Bedford Hills, I said in my professional voice, trying not to sound as curious as I was. L.T. hesitated a moment before drawing a short breath. Yes, Ms. Daniels. Not sure why her file is blank, but it's not much of a hassle. She will be gone in the morning. I'll have one of the admins backdate her file to reflect her stay with us." Then there it was. That smell. The burning that fills my nostrils. I took a moment to stifle a choke. I'm usually good with the stench unless I'm not expecting it. What could L.T. have to keep from me? Not wanting to make it too obvious, I decided to play along. "No problem, sir. Is there anything I can do to assist?" The L.T. finally gave his attention over to me. "As a matter of fact, there is. We were hoping you could ask her a few questions. The commissioner offered up your name. You have a very good track record with these sorts of things. We're hoping you could gather as much information about her crimes as possible." I stared back at him, confused, with my eyebrows scrunched high. "Sir, I don't even know what she's done. How am I supposed to get answers about what she hasn't done? If she's a transfer, that must mean she's been convicted, right?" L.T. Watkins scanned my face for a moment, deep in thought. "I know these are bizarre circumstances, and I wish I knew more, but you have to understand. Orders are orders. The commissioner himself came to me to tell me you had to talk with her. I haven't been able to reach him or anyone else from the department leadership tonight about the blank file. Let's just make it easy. Go in there and ask the basics. Who she is, why she's locked up. In the morning, we will pass the report up saying our reference file was blank, so the interview yielded no results." The stench of burned hair seemed to fill the room. Whatever it was he was lying about had to be important. Not wanting to give myself away, and with my curiosity piqued, I nodded my head. Around midnight, my phone rang. It was L.T. saying she was in the interview room. He'd be watching. He told me to take my time, to give her time to get antsy. I finished filing away the report on the Berkeley kid, grabbed 2 cups of water and headed over. As I stepped into the room, the 2 paper cups fell from my hands as I took in what I was seeing. Claire Daniels was a small, frail girl with matted blonde hair atop her head. She couldn't have been any older than 17. Still, her arms and legs had been shackled to the table. She didn't seem to notice me or the restraints. She gazed around the room, periodically staring into the 2-way mirror, chuckling to herself. She was droning on about something, but I couldn't make out the words. My stomach churned with discomfort. just as I was about to leave the room. To go demand LT tell me what the fuck was going on. Her eyes settled on mine. "Hello, Sergeant Buchanan," the girl said with a calm voice. Caught off guard, I stepped further into the room, allowing years of instinct to take over. I would handle this like any other interview. Afterward, I'd find out what was really going on here. "Hello, my name is Sergeant Buchanan. Badge number 2271. I would like to remind you that you have the right to remain silent." Blah blah blah. "I know. It's good to finally meet you," she smirked. A feeling of unease passed over me. Who is this girl? Did someone tell her I was coming? Can you please state your name, age, and date of birth? Claire Daniels, 17, December 17, 2004, she said in a mocking, dry tone. "Well, firstly, you mind telling me why you're here?" "Jaywalking," she said, continuing the mock, dry tone. The smell of lies filled the room. "Okay, and is that? You know your LT sent you in here to laugh at you, right?" She chuckled and looked towards the two-way glass. I could swear she was looking right through it. I didn't need to smell it to know she was lying to make me uneasy. This girl was a real class act. I continued, We have a blank file. And I want to understand what it was you've been charged with and why you're being transferred to the largest women's prison in NYC. I said, trying to mimic her dry tone. He just wants to watch you embarrass yourself trying to figure out what I did. I bet you he doesn't even know why I'm here. Her voice was getting louder as she continued to stare down the glass. Switching tactics, I thought I would try and appeal to whatever whimsical thoughts she might have. "Well, in that case, why don't you tell me and we can really show him how much he doesn't know?" It was a bad move and I knew it. But clearly this girl had something wrong with her. She stared blankly at me for a moment and began to talk rapidly. It felt almost like a prepared speech, like she had rehearsed this. "Your LT hates you. That's why you're here. I heard some of the other people in here talking, whispering. They all want you out." The smell returned, heavy this time. Clearly I wasn't going to get anything out of this other than harassments and a bunch of made-up drama. "I know all your secrets. You can't hide them from me." The smell grew stronger. This kid was full of it. As I stood up to walk away, content that I could classify this girl as crazy, the smell dissipated. She said one final thing before I reached for the door handle. "Your family isn't safe." I turned around to see her grinning, wild eyes staring up at me. I waited again for the smell of her empty threat to hit me, for that burned stench to reach me from her lies. When it didn't happen, she nodded as if to say, "Got you." Mysteries are everywhere, and some may be closer than you think. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the next mystery. See you in the next story.